They said my spring water was a flood risk on land that's been in my family for generations. So the HOA dug trenches, installed illegal drains, and sucked my spring dry without a second thought. But what they didn't realize is I'm a licensed hydrologist. I mapped every slope, every runoff, every underground stream. And while they were busy draining me dry, I was quietly rerouting nature itself, right back into their basements. My grandfather used to say that the land talks if you listen close enough, and for as long as I can remember, our spring had been its voice. It bubbled softly all year, no matter the drought, no matter the season. That water had been the lifeblood of our farm for nearly a century. It wasn't just a spring, it was our pulse. I was raised near it, drank from it, even bathed in it as a kid. It fed our orchard, kept our cattle healthy, and made our home feel alive. That kind of natural blessing is rare, and you protect it like family. So when the stream started drying up, I knew something was wrong before a single leaf turned brown. First, I thought it was a fluke. Climate shifts, blocked debris, maybe a mild drought. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen this land breathe, and now it was choking. I started hiking upstream along the dry bed, tracing the shallow cuts, through the soil, noticing how unnaturally sharp and redirected the flow channels looked. That's when I found it, the trench. Not a small one either. It was freshly dug, about 3 feet deep and lined with black corrugated pipe. It looked like something from a professional construction site, complete with gravel-filled basins and artificial drainage grates. I followed the pipe, and it led me straight to the edge of the HOA's newest development, a smug little gated community that had popped up in the last few years like a rash across the hillside. Their homes were pristine, their lawns were lush, their sprinklers, oddly enough, were always running. It didn't take long to connect the dots. They weren't worried about flooding. They were stealing my water to keep their imported Kentucky. Bluegrass-looking showroom perfect. The worst part? They'd done it in silence. No permits, no letters, no calls, nothing. They acted like my land was just an inconvenient water source in the way of their precious aesthetics. That spring wasn't just mine legally, it was a protected natural feature. But the HOA had taken it upon themselves to reroute nature, labeling my property as a potential flood zone in their internal documents. Total fiction. My land sits lower, yes, but it's never flooded in 100 years because the spring was perfectly balanced. What they didn't know is I've worked in environmental sciences for over a decade. I specialize in hydrology. While they saw a stream as an obstacle, I understood its rhythms, its ecological footprint, its geological memory. Their amateur tampering didn't just offend me, it violated multiple state and federal protections. I started collecting evidence. I photographed the trench, recorded the illegal piping, took GPS-stamped images of their drainage system leading right back to the HOA's communal garden. I even found a fresh memo sent to their board, proudly outlining the water redirection plan and labeling my land as excess runoff potential. It was clear. They were stealing my spring to hydrate their own while blaming me for a non-existent risk. When I tried confronting them at their monthly meeting, I was shut down instantly. The board president, a smug ex-realtor named Carla, insisted that flood risk reduction justified the intervention. I asked for engineering reports. She had none. I asked who approved the work. She waved it off as a community initiative. I showed her my property title and water rights. She smiled and said, "Well, maybe it's time you shared." That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with ignorance, I was facing arrogance. They believed that because I lived on the edge of their bubble, they could rewrite the rules of nature and law. They thought I'd roll over. What they didn't realize was, I wasn't just a landowner. I was someone who knew how the water moved, where it could be moved, and exactly how to weaponize that knowledge. They'd declared war over water, and I don't lose battles on my own ground. I knew documentation was the first step, But exposing these smug water thieves meant more than just gathering evidence. I had to think like them, outmaneuver them. So I started asking the kind of questions that made HOA board members sweat. I requested formal records of permits. Nothing. I asked for their engineering reports, stormwater assessments, flood zone certificates. Again, crickets. The so-called flood risk mitigation that justified draining my spring was a complete fabrication. They didn't have a single approved plan filed with the city. And that's when the real rot began to show. Turns out the HOA hadn't just rerouted my spring, they'd quietly installed unauthorized French drains across multiple properties, each cleverly disguised as landscaping improvements. These weren't your standard backyard gutters either. I found PVC piping snaking under rock gardens, artificial channels cutting through public walkways, and even a hidden catchment basin cleverly tucked under a decorative gazebo. They'd created an entire underground water network designed to siphon and hoard without 1 ounce of legal backing, and it got worse. In one board meeting transcript I got my hands on through a sympathetic resident, the HOA president actually bragged about the setup. She called it their miracle green upgrade, and even joked about how the old guy down the hill hasn't figured it out yet. That old guy was me. They laughed about it. They joked about my water, my land, my legacy. But they didn't. No, I'd already installed 5 trail cams and a few discreetly positioned motion-triggered drones. I was logging footage day and night, video proof of the construction, the flow, the damage to my land. But I didn't stop at evidence collection. I went deeper. I hired an environmental attorney, one with a reputation for ripping HOA boards, apart in court, and I brought in an independent hydrologist to survey the area. His report? Brutal. Not only did their unauthorized construction increase erosion risk, they'd violated 3 state environmental codes and 2 federal water protection regulations. I now had a legal bomb in my back pocket. And while they were still sipping Chardonnay and watering their HOA tulips with my spring, I started digging, literally. Behind my barn, where the spring used to surface in full flow, I carved out a new catchment system of my own. With help from my cousin, a contractor, and a few friends from the county water department, we built a reservoir trench reinforced with concrete culverts and runoff redirection barriers. I wasn't just reclaiming my water. I was preparing to turn it into leverage. And here's the twist they didn't see coming. My cousin and I created a controlled floodgate system, not to damage them, but to prove a point. Using calibrated release valves, I could redirect the flow at will and show just how much water they were siphoning. Within days of completing it, I watched their sprinkler systems falter. Their ornamental lake dried up to a puddle. And the HOA's green paradise? It started turning brown around the edges. I hadn't touched a single home. I hadn't trespassed. I'd just taken back what was mine. They scrambled, of course. I got panicked emails from board members, miscommunication, apologies, even a request for a private meeting to resolve things amicably. But I wasn't done, not even close. Because while their houses were drying out, I was preparing Phase 2. My hydrologist's report included a devastating recommendation that the HOA's drainage setup, if left unregulated, could lead to backflow, issues in heavy rain, essentially turning their lush lawns into shallow retention ponds. A swamp. And with a little bit of smart timing, that swamp was coming sooner than they thought. They wanted to play dirty? They were about to drown in it. With everything in place, I had one final move to make, and this time, it was going to be a masterstroke. I wasn't just going to fight the HOA by following the law. I was going to bend the rules of nature against them. As someone who knew hydrology inside and out, I understood the way water moves, the forces that shape landscapes, and how easily one miscalculation could turn an HOA's miracle green project into a disastrous liability. The first step was simple. I began redirecting water from the hillside, the same water that flowed naturally through my land. It had always been there, quietly moving through the soil and rock, feeding my land, keeping my crops healthy, and filling my spring. But now, instead of letting it flow as it always had, I started guiding it directly into their drainage system. It wasn't a massive shift at first. It was just a small redirection, a subtle nudge, but it was enough to expose their vulnerability. See, their fancy drainage system wasn't designed to handle the amount of water I was redirecting. It wasn't made to accommodate natural flow, especially not the water from my hillside. It couldn't handle the volume, the intensity, and the sudden increase in pressure. And within a few weeks, I started seeing the first signs of the chaos I was sowing. At first, it was just a few puddles, small, inconspicuous, but they were enough to cause some concern. The HOA board, obsessed with maintaining their perfect lawns, started to panic. They couldn't ignore the water accumulating on their pristine properties, but they also couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Their first instinct was to blame poor landscaping or faulty irrigation systems, but nothing seemed to add up. As the weeks went by, those puddles began to grow. What had started as a small inconvenience soon turned into something bigger, much bigger. The water began seeping into their soil, slowly eroding the compact earth beneath their lawns. And it wasn't just any water. It was the rich, runoff water from my land, water that was moving faster than their pipes could handle. The strain was immediate, then came the sump pumps. They had no idea what was coming. Their fancy pumps, which were supposed to prevent flooding, began to struggle. They weren't built to handle the volume of water I was sending through their system. Slowly, pump after pump began to fail. At first, it was a few homes here and there, but soon it was an entire section of the neighborhood. And when those pumps failed, water began to pool up in basements, seeping into walls and flooding storage rooms. The pristine lawns they worked so hard to cultivate, now they were swamped, with water creeping through the foundations and into their homes, and it only got worse. Within 2 months, the situation had escalated to the point where even their most well-maintained properties were showing signs of water damage. Their houses, which had once stood tall and proud, were now teetering on the brink of becoming waterlogged disaster zones. The HOA's perfect landscape was turning into a swamp. The residents were panicking. The once beautiful lawns were now swampy marshlands. Gardens turned into bogs. Decks and patios were beginning to sink into the softening earth. It wasn't just a physical problem, it was a public relations nightmare. The HOA board, who had spent years creating the illusion of control, now had to scramble for answers. Their solution was to downplay the problem. They called it unexplained swampification. They even tried to pass it off as some sort of rare geological event. But the residents weren't buying it. The damage was real. The problem was too widespread to hide, and as all of this unfolded, I watched from my farm. I didn't have to lift a finger. The HOA had built their own undoing. They thought they could control the water that flowed through the land, but nature had a way of fighting back. And now, it was clear who was really in control. I had used the knowledge I'd spent years cultivating to expose their arrogance and ignorance. The HOA had believed they could manipulate the system without any consequences, but they hadn't taken into account the very thing they thought they could control: water. What they didn't know was that when you mess with the flow of nature, nature has a way of messing right back. The floodgates were open. The HOA had finally met their match, and it wasn't in a court of law. It was in the trenches of their own failed drainage system, their own crumbling infrastructure, and the unstoppable force of the water that they had tried to steal from me. What I did wasn't just revenge, it was nature's retribution. And it was the perfect way to show the HOA that you can't play God with the land and expect no consequences. The situation quickly spiraled out of control for the HOA. Once the damage became undeniable, the board tried to control the narrative, but it was already too late. The flood of complaints from residents and mounting pressure from public officials turned their world upside down. Residents who had once quietly complied with every rule were now marching into HOA meetings, demanding answers. For the first time in years, there were voices loud enough to shake the foundation of the HOA's authority. And the board. They were scrambling. With each passing day, it became harder for the HOA to maintain the illusion of competence. They called an emergency meeting to try to resolve the issue and to soothe an increasingly angry community. But the damage had already been done. The homeowners, many of whom had never questioned the HOA's actions before, were now furious. They wanted to know why their homes were flooding, why their foundations were sinking, why their once pristine lawns were now swamps. The board had no answers, only excuses. But excuses didn't work anymore. Not when the truth was undeniable, and not when I had the proof to back it up. I wasn't about to let them get away with their lies. Armed with maps of the water diversion, systems I had uncovered, videos showing the entire process of them rerouting my spring, and documents that proved their negligence and disregard for state and federal regulations, I took action. The videos were time-stamped, showing every step of their construction, from the initial drainage channels to the hidden pipes buried beneath the ground. There was no denying the conspiracy they had carried out, and I made sure the residents saw every detail. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with my stack of evidence, the air thick with anticipation. People were restless, whispering, and I could feel the tension building. The HOA president tried to maintain her usual calm, but I could tell she was visibly rattled. I handed the evidence over to the residents, and soon everyone could see what had really happened. The president's face turned white as the details came to light. It was like a switch flipped in the room. No one was pretending anymore. The residents wanted justice, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. But that wasn't the end of it. As the legal and public pressure continued to mount, more and more layers of their corruption and negligence unraveled. Code enforcement. Officials arrived, armed with citations and demands for corrective actions. It was clear that the HOA had violated numerous building and environmental codes. These weren't just minor infractions. These were serious violations that had caused real, irreversible damage to the properties within the community. The citations kept piling up, each one a nail in the coffin of the HOA's once stable authority. But the real blow came when environmental protection agencies got involved. I had taken my evidence directly to the state's Environmental Oversight Department, showing them how the HOA had drained my spring and rerouted water without permits or environmental reviews. I had already gathered enough to warrant an investigation, and the findings were damning. The damage wasn't just a local issue. It was a violation of state water laws, and the HOA had no legal basis for what they had done. The investigation quickly turned into a full-scale inquiry into their actions, with fines and penalties quickly following. Soon, the city was involved. The fines hit the HOA like a ton of bricks. A $70,000 fine for unauthorized water diversion was levied, a staggering sum that made it clear just how serious the consequences of their actions were. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a financial blow that would take years to recover from. I watched as the HOA's board members, who had once been so smug, now sat in silence, looking like they had been hit by a freight train. They were losing control, and everyone knew it. But the best part of all came when the HOA president was forced to resign. With the legal and financial pressure mounting, she couldn't maintain the facade of leadership any longer. Her resignation was a public spectacle, a sign that even the most powerful figures in the HOA were not immune to the consequences of their actions. The entire community had watched her fall from grace, and the message was clear. There were consequences for those who abused their power. As if that wasn't enough, their so-called flood risk excuse was exposed as the sham it had always been. It had been their cover story for draining my spring in the first place, something they claimed was necessary for the safety of the entire community. But as the investigation into their actions unfolded, it became clear that their flood risk concerns were nothing more than a fabricated lie designed to justify their illegal actions. The truth came out, and the HOA had no defense. They had lied, manipulated, and used fear to control the residents, all while secretly diverting water for their own benefit. And so, with each passing day, the HOA's reputation crumbled. Lawsuits were filed left and right. Some residents even launched civil suits against the HOA, seeking compensation for property damage, loss of value, and emotional distress. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about holding the board accountable for the years of abuse they had inflicted on the community. The HOA board had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions, and they did so with the full weight of the law coming down on them. I watched it all unfold, knowing that I had exposed them for what they truly were: power-hungry, dishonest individuals who thought they could control everything without ever facing any real consequences. But in the end, they learned the hard way that you can't mess with someone's livelihood, especially when that someone knows how to fight back. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. The HOA was done. The battle had been long, but the results were nothing short of satisfying. After weeks of legal maneuvering, strategic planning, and relentless determination, the spring was restored. I knew it wasn't just about getting my water back. It was about making sure the HOA understood the full scope of the consequences for their reckless actions. What they had drained out of arrogance and ignorance, I was going to return tenfold in terms of consequences. Not only had I restored my spring, but I had done it in a way that would ensure they could never repeat their mistake. First, I focused on rebuilding the stream bed. I didn't just want the spring to flow again. I wanted it to flow better than it had before. I meticulously restored the natural pathways, using the same techniques that had been used by conservationists for years. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about creating a natural, sustainable water system that could support both my land and the surrounding environment for generations to come. I even went above and beyond, planting new vegetation along the water's edge to further stabilize the land and prevent erosion. This spring wasn't just a resource. It was a symbol of my victory over the HOA. Once the spring was flowing freely, I knew it was time to set up monitoring systems to ensure that the water remained protected from future interference. I installed a series of sensors and cameras that would track the flow of water, alerting me to any changes. These would allow me to keep an eye on the spring 24/7, ensuring that nothing and no one could tamper with it again. I also made sure that all the data was securely stored in case I needed it for future legal action. This wasn't just about making my spring flow again. It was about setting up a fortress of proof that the HOA could never challenge. I wasn't just protecting my land. I was protecting my rights. Meanwhile, the HOA was facing the consequences of their actions. I wasn't the only one affected by their reckless decisions. The drainage issues they had caused had spilled over into the rest of the community. As the investigations into their actions progressed, the HOA was forced to pay for drainage repairs across half the community. These weren't small fixes either. The HOA had to fund major repairs to homes that had been damaged by flooding, homes that had seen their foundations shift and walls crack as a result of their mismanagement of water resources. The repairs were expensive, and the HOA had no choice but to foot the bill. They had to pay for the damage they had caused, and that was only the beginning. I knew it would hurt their wallets, but nothing felt better than watching them squirm as they realized just how much their arrogance had cost them. What I had learned throughout this entire process was that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a legal threat or a high-stakes lawsuit, it's the land itself. The HOA had tried to use water as a tool for control, but they had underestimated the power of nature. They had tried to manipulate something that couldn't be controlled, and in doing so, they had set in motion a series of events that would come back to haunt them. Water, after all, is a force of nature. And in the end, It was the very thing they tried to weaponize that turned the tables on them. They had tried to drain it. I had restored it, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the power. It wasn't just about the money or the repairs. It was about sending a message to the entire community. Don't mess with someone who understands the land. Don't think you can use legal threats, intimidation, and bullying tactics to get what you want. The HOA learned that there were limits to their control, and they had pushed too far. They had made enemies of the wrong people, and that would cost them for years to come. The residents who had once been silent now watched with admiration as I fought back and won. It wasn't just my victory. It was the victory of every person in the neighborhood who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's arbitrary rule. The ultimate satisfaction came when I received word that the HOA had been forced to reevaluate its approach to managing the community. The board members who had been responsible for the water diversion scheme were removed from their positions, and the HOA was forced to implement new policies to prevent further environmental damage. They were now being monitored by both the local authorities and the state environmental agency, and any future projects they proposed would undergo strict scrutiny. The community had taken back its power, and the HOA had been exposed for what it really was, a corrupt, self-serving entity that cared more about control than the well-being of the people it was supposed to serve. I had won. But more importantly, the HOA had lost. They had tried to manipulate nature, and in the end, nature had turned on them. I had used their own arrogance against them, and the consequences they faced would echo through their ranks for years. They had learned the hard way that you don't mess with the land, and you definitely don't mess with someone who knows how to turn that land into a weapon. They had thought they could control everything, but in the end, they were the ones who were controlled. If you've enjoyed seeing how one person can stand up against the relentless force of an HOA, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on more jaw-dropping stories like this. Join us for more epic battles, shocking twists, and unforgettable moments on the HOA stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified every time we upload new content that will keep you hooked. And coming back for more. Stay tuned, and let's continue to take down the bullies, one story at a time.